All right, welcome back to the last video of this week. It's on research design. So the first video we went over research questions. Second video is the process of research, especially when it comes to this class. And then now research designs, like what are the designs within research. So there are generally two different types of approaches when it comes to research. There's deduction and induction. Deduction usually starts with a theory, right? So one theory so a lot of people use maybe evolutionary theory, right? So let me say, I'll use theory of evolution, and from that theory, there are some hypotheses you can make. I think based on the theory of evolution that men are gonna want to date a lot more women or something like that, right? You have come up with a hypothesis, and then you go to you once you have those hypotheses based on the theory, then you go and you do some observations. You go and observe, dating websites or on Facebook, or you just go and observe the way men interact with women. You can count and, see, how it goes. And then that leaves the confirmation. Either it confirms that, like, oh, yep, data shows or confirms my hypothesis that men want to date as many women as possible, or actually, it doesn't confirm women want to date as many men as possible, or whatever, like based on the observation. That's the deduction kind of way. You start with a theory, you develop a hypothesis, then you go observe the data, and then that data either confirms or does not confirm that theory, and you go back, right? So if it does confirm it, then you go back to the theory, and then you go through the process again to see something more specific about it. Induction is the other way around. So if like you flip it upside down, where you start with an observation, you don't start with any theory because you don't want that to, bias the way you look at things. You just go and look at data and you say, hey, I'm going to go on dating websites and I'm going to observe dating websites. I'm going to observe dating chats and all of that. And then I'm going to see a pattern. I realize that, there's a pattern. There's a difference between the way men and women talk to each other on dating websites. And based on these patterns, you're going to make tentative hypotheses. From this, I hypothesize that, men are a lot more forward when it comes to dating, and I'm just coming up with I don't know. If you come up with a tentative hypothesis, then you create a theory. Based on this hypothesis and these patterns, there is a theory of dating when it comes to this. Does that make sense? And then you use that to go into another observation, develop more patterns, tentative hypothesis, in maybe another context. So there's deduction and induction. Okay, research designs. Now, when it comes to actually the observation part of research and in disciplines, there are different types of approaches to researching something. So there's cross-sectional designs, which I'll talk about that. Longitudinal, which is data collected over time. Trends, which is cross-sectional repeated. Panel designs and cohort designs. I'm going to talk about each of those very briefly. So cross-sectional, this just means that it's like a survey or something that's collected all at the same time. So like maybe we do a survey back in 2017. It was all the questions are asked at the same time. In this one, the reason why it's cross-sectional is because you can't really say it really causes it because they're both collected at the same time. Like cause of something really means that this precedes that, so there has to be some time between it. In a cross-sectional design, you're finding out the information at the same time, so there is no temporal relationship that you can really say. So that's the downfall of cross-sectional designs, but at least you can get some of it. You may be able to infer causality that something causes it, but you can't really say. You know what I mean? So that's cross-sectional designs. Longitudinal designs is usually when it's the same questions asked over a different period of time. So, maybe when you're 25, I ask you, how many times, how many hours a day do you work out? Then we ask you at 35, 10 years later, how many times do you work out? And then 45, and then 55. And then if you're able to see that and track it over time, you can say, you know what? As they get older, people work out less. Does that make sense? So like at that point, then you can say there's temporal precedence, and you can say that there's causality. Like age does cause less time of working out, or age, like as you get older, you make more money or something. Does that make sense? That one you can say that there's causality. So it's essentially when you collect it, the same data over different points of time. It can be, every, over a year, 2 or 3 times over a year, or every 10 years, 5 years. It's just something that's collected over time. Okay. Now the next one is repeated cross-sectional designs. And that's essentially where it mixes both of them. So you ask like different questions about different topics, about maybe sexuality and education and employment and all that. You ask all these different topics, and then 5 years later you ask the same questions, and then 5 years later another same questions, and then over across those 3 time points you can see the relationship. So that's repeated cross-sectional design. Last one is there's panel or cohort designs. And a panel is when you ask the same person, the same question over a period of time. So for example, I used early childhood longitudinal study, which is a panel design where it interviews kids at kindergarten, asks them questions and tests them, and then it comes back on first grade, and then third grade, and then fifth grade, and then eighth grade. But it's the same students. If it's the same person tracked over time, that's a panel design. But if it's a cohort design, it's not the same person. It's usually just a group of people that they follow. So maybe they ask people back in the 70s, they do a survey with teenagers or people from the 70s. They ask them questions, and then they ask the same question in the 80s, but it's a different set of people, but that have same characteristics. Does that make sense? So like maybe they just interview 8th graders in the 70s, and then they ask another group of 8th graders in the 80s, and then they compare the difference. And they're really interested in birth cohorts, like how does millennials compare to Generation X or Generation Z, and what is the difference across generations? So that would be more of a cohort design. It's not the same people, but it's the same kind of group over time. So that's just different research of time. So if I was going to do this, I'm going to have you guys get together and kind of practice it, try to come up with, if you come up with a question, like with each question, there's different ways to research it, right? So if you like use a cross-sectional design, you research, you ask this one question about dating, you use survey data, cross-sectional, that would help you get some information. But if you used like a repeated cross-sectional design, that will help you kind of see how does it change over time. Or if you use a cohort design, what's the difference between Gen Z dating life and millennials dating life, right? Like these designs kind of impact a little bit the outcomes of the research or what you're interested in. Okay, so now next part, annotate bibliography. I think that's next week or the following week. This is important. So whenever your first step this week is to develop your research question, your independent and dependent variable. And then like the last video I described how to find research articles about the topics that you're interested in. Now annotated bibliography is pretty much just documenting the different articles that you're using. So you're going to come up with about 8 to 10 articles, and you're going to come up with them, and you're going to do an annotated bibliography, right? So during research, if you're researching or in any class, you go over a lot of articles, and an annotated bibliography just helps you kind of track and kind of like summarize those and help it's really honestly, annotated bibliography for me is like a rough draft of your paper of your literature review. Like this is the first step of your literature review. If you read it and you just summarize. So here's what I'm going to want for annotated bibliography next week is that they should have a full citation. You'll cite the full thing. You'll write out what's their research question, what kind of theory do they use, what type of data do they use, what did they find, and what are your thoughts about this article. It's really, I just want like a small paragraph where you just answer those. You could do it in this way if you want. So the layout would look like this. There's a citation. You have the author's name, the title, and the journal. And then you'll see some of those in-text citations, right? So you'll use the ASA format. We'll talk about that later. Or APA, whichever format, as long as it's the same one across all of it. Okay. So here's an example of an annotated bibliography for one article, right? So you have the citation on the top. Then we find out here's the research question. You just say it. Theory, you can briefly describe it in one sentence or just say what the theory is. The data, what type of data did they use? Like it will say that in the method sections of that paper. What are the key findings? That's important because then you can kind of mention that when you do a literature review. And then your reflections like, oh, I like this article. I think it will help me when I write the paper. It will tell me this or this or this. Something very brief like that. Because once you do that and you do that with 8 articles, you almost, like if you line them up, you almost have a literature review. So this is great. This is like the next part, but this will be due like next week or the following week. Okay, so that's what's going to be coming up next. All right. Now, if anytime you refer to one of these articles, when you do a research, when you do your literature review, which we'll talk about later, you want to put a citation on. So that's why I like it. If you like it, then you should have put a citation on it. Anyways, I like that. Anyways, that's the end of this video and the end of this week. I hope you all enjoy. Just do that research question. This is the beginning of your research paper. Developing that research question, finding those keywords, because next week you will do what we talked about in this video and in the second video about the research process. About you'll be finding the research articles and doing an annotated bibliography. That will be the next step. Then the next writing assignment will be writing, a literature review. So we'll talk about that later. All right, guys, have a great week.